Jesus, as we know, is a remarkable teacher who would take little things in life and make them into something much deeper in meaning if we are just paying attention, using the things of the culture to teach deep truths, even something as simple as agriculture, as fruit on a tree, specifically today talking about figs and how they grow. You know, the idea of figs is something that Jesus talked about on more than one occasion. I want to start by going over to Matthew 21. Early in the morning, Jesus, was on the way back to the city, and he was hungry. Seeing a fig tree beside the road, he went up to it, but found nothing on it except leaves. Then he said to it, "May you never bear fruit again." Immediately, the tree withered. When the disciples saw this, they were amazed. How did the fig tree wither so quickly? They asked. Now we know Jesus didn't do things arbitrarily. And if you read on, you see that Matthew couches this as a lesson in faith. But why curse a tree? Now Jesus is on his way to the temple. And in first century Judaism, the fig tree was actually used as a symbol of Jewish spirituality, of the Jewish leadership and authority. And you see, Jesus is on his way to the temple to declare that the Jewish leadership is essentially irrelevant. And on the way there, he curses this fig tree, this symbol of the Jewish spiritual establishment. In other words, we might say he's burning the flag. He's drawing a line in the sand. And this seemingly little act, which you might go, was he just that hungry and he got mad and upset? That had nothing to do with his belly. It really is loaded with religious, social, political meaning. If you look at Matthew's timeline as he tells the story, Jesus does this the day after he has done what we call the cleansing of the temple. And that morning after, Jesus is on his way back to the temple, fully expecting a confrontation. Essentially, by this act, Jesus is saying that this entire system, this entire complex, the temple complex, and all of its meaning is going down because it has turned against God. In effect, saying all of this that you see in Jerusalem is no longer the way to come to God. The way to come to God is through me now, through Jesus now. In Matthew 20:19, as Jesus is passing that tree, you notice that the presence of leaves led Jesus to expect that there may be fruit there. And when he found none, he cursed the tree for its fruitlessness. Now, Mark tells this same story, but he tells a different version of the incident. And notice that there are a couple of differences. Mark 11, we read this: Jesus entered Jerusalem and went to the temple. He looked around and saw everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. The next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And the disciples heard him say it. Now, did you notice a couple of differences here? Mark says that right after the triumphal entry, that's that thing we remember on Palm Sunday, right? Jesus goes into the temple, and he's looking around, and he sees what's going on. He sees where the money changers are shortchanging those who have traveled from a distance as they changed Roman coin for the temple coin. He sees how there are lambs that are perfect for sacrifice that are being rejected, while other lambs are being sold in order to profit off of that. He sees these things going on, and it's late in the day. So instead of doing anything about it right then, he decides to go to Bethany, where perhaps we might think he is thinking about exactly what needs to be done. It is the next day, on his way to the temple for what we would call the cleansing of the temple, he burns the flag. He curses the fig tree. Now note, Mark also adds that Jesus found nothing but leaves on the tree because it was not the season for figs. So why, if it's not the season for the fruit to be out, why curse the tree? Well, Jesus may have been looking for what is known as the early fruit, or the blossoms that appear in the spring before the leaves open, that are on the branches from last year's growth. The first ripe fruit of that season would not be ready, not on the new growth, because that wouldn't happen until June or so. And on the timeline, this was more like April. So what he's looking for are those fruit that were left from August up to October, that when it wintered, the fruit went dormant but stayed on the tree. You see, the key may be in that Jesus was looking for the unripe fruit of autumn, which often survived the winter in a dormant state, and as things are warming up, that fruit would ripen even before the new growth and blossoms had a chance to turn into fruit. So around April, he's looking at the tree, looking for the autumn fruit, and it wasn't there, which could be an indication that that tree had not produced fruit for a long time. Because fig trees that retain their leaves through the winter usually had last year's figs there to ripen. So there's a really good chance that Jesus was not looking for new fruit. What he was expecting was last year's fruit. What had the tree been doing? You see, the expectation of the fruit from the previous season because there were leaves on the tree. Those leaves were deceptive. The outward appearance didn't match what was expected. The application of this incident to Israel really is quite simple. Their leafy look covered their laziness. They had the look of life, but there was nothing to show for it. Now, this actually helps us to understand the parable that Luke records in Luke 13, to understand that parable that Jesus told there. We're going to start at verse 6. Then Jesus told this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he went to look for fruit on it, but didn't find any. What do you think he actually found? Probably leaves, yeah? So he said to the man who took care of the vineyard, for 3 years now I have come looking for the fruit on this fig tree and haven't found any. Cut it down. Why should it use up the soil? Sir, the man replied, leave it alone for 1 more year, and I'll dig around it and fertilize it. If it bears fruit next year, fine. If not, then cut it down. As you're reading through Luke 13, you see that the real key to this parable is actually mentioned twice already in chapter 13, at verse 3 and verse 5, where Jesus says, unless you repent, you too will perish. Apparently, some of the Jews were upset because of Rome's behavior. How could he be so cruel to some Galileans? And Jesus basically told the crowd, forget about Rome and deal with your own behavior. The fig tree, a symbol of the Jewish spiritual leadership and authority. A fig tree that was planted by an owner, God, placed in a vineyard where it was given a place and a purpose. And although it was well tended, all it had to show for it was leaves. It did not fulfill its true purpose. So the gardener, full of grace and compassion and wanting to save that fig tree, should remind us of Christ, who ministered to the leaders in the nation of Israel, trying everything he could to get their attention, to get them to change and to come around, but to no avail. Their focus, like we see in Luke 13, was on what someone else was doing, not on what they were doing. In other words, leafy trees that don't bear fruit seal their own fate. History shows that Emperor Titus sent the axeman Vespasian over into Jerusalem to deal with the rowdy, rambunctious, rebellious Jews. And in AD 70, he flattened Jerusalem. He flattened the Jewish nation. He destroyed the temple and killed over 1 million Jews in the process. And through Christ, through his death on the cross, God planted a new tree and planted it in a vineyard and has given it a place and a purpose. Which brings us to Matthew 7, where Jesus says, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. False prophets, is this the first mention of that in the Sermon on the Mount? Well, if you go back and you look from verse 25, 20, 21, and you read all the way through 7:12, you see that false prophets were those who were leading the people astray. Those who say you can love your brother and hate your enemy. Those who say, who don't see sin in lust because they haven't committed the actual act yet. Those who break covenant at the drop of a hat and justify it by splitting hairs. Those who insist on their right to retaliation instead of extending mercy. Those who ask for forgiveness but refuse to extend forgiveness to others from their own heart. Those who nitpick others while their own sin hangs like a plank out of their eye. Who are those false prophets? You should know. You should know who Jesus is speaking against. He has spent the bulk of this sermon condemning their superficial religious practice. They that walk a broad road that leads to destruction, which he said in Matthew 5:20, who will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. How do we know these false prophets? Verse 16, by their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. Again, leafy trees that bear no fruit seal their own fate. But Jesus doesn't stop there. It's not just the Jewish leadership, but everyone who professes faith in God will be held accountable. Look at verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father in heaven. By the way, that's your memory verse for today. Not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles? Lord, Lord, look at my leaves. You see how big they are? Aren't they pretty? I'm covered with them. I've got lots and lots of leaves. Leaves as miracles and prophecy. Leaves of driving out demons. Which, by the way, I don't recall Jesus ever commanding that. Maybe I'm wrong. Why don't you read and study and let me know if I'm wrong? Leaves. Miracles, prophecy, driving out demons. They're good things, but they are not the main thing. Verse 23, then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you're evil doers. What is the great evil that they have committed? They're in the right place. They're having the right purpose, but they haven't produced anything. They've got lots of leaves, but no fruit. And all of a sudden, as you're reading here in Matthew 7, you begin to realize that we, the people of God, the church, we are the tree Jesus is talking about. You see, that old tree got chopped down, and a new tree has been planted. So, what is the fruit we are supposed to be producing? Is it righteousness? Is it living good lives? Is it godly living? Is it God-honoring morality? I think all of those things are leaves. They're good things, but they're not the main thing. In fact, it was the presence of those very leaves that led the Pharisees to become hypercritical and judgmental. And they were judged by the rule by which they judged others. So let me ask you, who or what is the church? Is it a collective, or is it individuals that come together? Can I get a both and? Can I get it's not an either or, but a both and, right? It's individuals who come together collectively that make the whole. Yes? Let me ask you an easy question. What is the number one priority of the church? What is it? Make disciples, evangelism. Yes? That is the number one priority. We will agree with that. I have never stood in front of a group and asked that question where it could not be answered by the group. Let me say this. By simple deduction, if the church is made up of individuals and it's the individual effort that makes the church what it is, if evangelism is not your number one priority, then it is not the number one priority of the church. It simply isn't. Our leaves, our worship time, our singing, our prayers, our studying in Scripture, is what we are doing, is that producing any fruit? Or are we just going through the motions, looking good, doing good things, but missing the real mission, the real purpose of why we are here. In Matthew 7:21, Jesus is clear that we are to do the will of the Father. That our number one priority is to change the world through the good news of Jesus Christ. And friends, you do that one relationship at a time. You can do this. We can do this together. There's one other place where Jesus talks about vine and branches and fruit and all of that. I'm not going to go through that today, but maybe this afternoon you should read through there where he talks about the vine and the gardener and the branches that do not produce fruit. Branches that are connected to the vine of Christ are supposed to produce fruit. So I'm going to leave you with this. Don't forget about the leaves. Grow leaves and produce fruit.